Imagine waking up in a world without clocks, without running water, without heat unless you built it yourself. A world where the morning air could mean frostbite if your fire died in the night, or a draft through the cracks of a home made from mud and timber. This is not the romanticized version of medieval life painted in fantasy books and films. This is the unpolished, harrowing truth. This is the hidden world of ceaseless struggle, where mere survival was a full-time job, and the challenges came not just from invaders or lords, but from life itself. The secret struggles of medieval life were many, often invisible to history books. They weren't just about the grand battles or royal disputes, but about how common people lived day to day under the weight of a system that never truly served them. Imagine you're a peasant waking up in the early morning cold, your feet wrapped in straw instead of socks, your breath forming clouds as you move about your tiny, one-room hut. Your family sleeps nearby on piles of hay or cloth, huddled for warmth. There's no privacy, no comfort, no certainty. Food is the first concern. You have a small plot of land, but it's not yours, it belongs to a lord, and you're expected to give a portion of whatever you grow to him. That might be grain, eggs, or even part of the livestock you raise. And if the harvest fails, you still owe him. Famine doesn't care if you're hungry. Obligations persist. In a good year, you have just enough to eat. In a bad year, you face the same slow starvation as your neighbors. Some may beg, others may steal. Most will simply suffer. Illness lurks everywhere. Your child coughs in the corner, wrapped in a tattered cloth. There's no doctor, only a wise woman from the next village who knows a few herbs. If she can reach you in time, maybe she can help. But the truth is, most ailments are a death sentence. A simple infected cut can kill. A fever might burn through a household. And when something worse comes, like the plague or the pox, there's little hope at all. Your clothing is another reminder of your place in the world. It's rough, uncomfortable, and made to last years, not months. You can't afford luxury. Even dye is a rare indulgence. Bright colors mark wealth. You wear browns, grays, maybe a faded blue if you're lucky. Everything smells of smoke, sweat, and the outdoors. Cleanliness isn't a goal. It's a concept most people don't even prioritize, because survival always comes first. Water must be fetched from a stream or well, often a long walk away. It might be dirty, or worse, infected with waste. But there's no choice. You drink it, cook with it, and bathe in it when you can, which might be once a season. Toothaches are common. Most people lose teeth early. Some die from them. Personal hygiene is minimal. You clean your hands when they're visibly dirty. Baths are communal, rare, and not necessarily helpful against disease. Everywhere the church looms large. It tells you how to live, what to fear, and what your suffering means. You're told it is righteous, that your pain is a test, that those who suffer in this life will be rewarded in the next. And you believe it, because what else can you believe? Hope is the only wealth you possess. Sometimes, you sneak into the back of the church, listening to the priest speak in Latin, a language you do not understand. But the songs are soothing, the candles warm. You spend most of your day working. The land requires constant labor plowing, planting, weeding, harvesting. Your tools are simple, often handmade. There's little margin for error. You break a tool, and your family suffers. Injure yourself, and there's no rest. You work through the pain, or you don't eat. Your children work beside you, as soon as they can walk and carry things. Childhood is brief and hard. Play is occasional. Laughter even more so. And then there are the taxes. Always taxes. The Lord demands his share. The church too. You pay in goods, in labor, sometimes in coin if you have it. But you rarely do. And if you fall behind, you might lose your home, your land, your family's livelihood. There's no appeal. The system is built against you, and justice is reserved for those with power. If a nobleman harms your daughter or takes your animals, there's little you can do. You might complain, but you won't be heard. The law protects wealth, not truth. Winter is the cruelest season. The fields are bare, the cold penetrates everything, and the nights stretch on endlessly. You ration what food you have. Sometimes you boil bones just to make a weak broth. Sometimes you go to bed hungry. Sometimes you don't wake up. Families often lose someone during winter. Children, especially, don't always survive. The silence that follows is heavy. But grief has no time in this world. The living must keep going. Entertainment is rare. Maybe a traveling bard visits the village once a year. Maybe there's a festival. But even then, you're expected to work before and after it. A wedding or birth can bring joy, but also more mouths to feed. Celebration is simple. Shared food, music, dance around a fire. Joy is fleeting. But those moments matter. They are the thin thread that keeps people going. And still, there is love. There are friendships. Families bond through struggle. People sing while working. Children chase chickens through the mud. Couples share a quiet moment at night, grateful simply to have made it through another day. These moments are few, but they shine bright against the darkness. There is pride, too. Pride in surviving, in making bread from almost nothing, in mending a shirt that should have fallen apart, in raising a child who can carry on. No one writes your story, but you live it fully, moment by moment, each one a small act of defiance against the crushing weight of the world. And then one day, something changes. A whisper of news, a war, a new tax, a disease spreading in the next town. You hold your breath, because change rarely means better. It usually means danger. You brace yourself, tighten your belt, and go on. Because what choice do you have? This is the reality of medieval life. Not knights and banquets, but dirt and duty. The secret struggle of simply staying alive, of finding warmth in a cold world, meaning in misery, and strength where no one expected it. This is the story that history rarely tells, but it is real, and it is the story of millions who came before you. Their lives, mostly anonymous, built the foundation of everything you now take for granted. They didn't survive because they were stronger than you. They survived because they had no other option. That is the secret truth. And as we explore their world, piece by piece, remember, you wouldn't believe how tough it was. But they lived it. And that is something worth remembering. Amid this harsh environment, every aspect of medieval life was influenced by the struggle to survive. Food, shelter, health, and safety were daily concerns. The simple act of staying alive demanded endurance and resilience. Few today can truly imagine. Take shelter, for example. Most peasants lived in small, one-room homes made of wattle and daub, a lattice of wood covered in mud or clay. These huts were drafty, cold, and often damp. Winters were brutal. Without insulation, and with only a small hearth to provide warmth, families huddled close together to stave off the cold. Smoke from the fire would fill the hut, as there were no chimneys, making the air thick and often choking. The floor was dirt, sometimes strewn with straw to soften the ground. Privacy was non-existent. Families, sometimes extended, slept in the same room on piles of hay or simple bedding. Their belongings were few: a wooden table, a couple of stools, cooking pots, and perhaps a crude spinning wheel or loom for making cloth. Personal space was a luxury denied to most. Water, essential for life, was often a dangerous necessity. Wells or streams were the sources, but contamination was common. Human and animal waste, thrown into open ditches or nearby fields, frequently found its way into water supplies. Dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne diseases were rampant. People had little knowledge of germs or hygiene, and the concept of clean water was foreign. Boiling water wasn't routine, it required precious fuel and time. Hygiene overall was minimal. Bathing was rare, and often communal. In many cases, people washed their hands and faces with cold water once in a while, but full body washing could happen only a few times a year, if at all. This lack of cleanliness contributed to lice infestations, skin diseases, and other ailments. Medical care was rudimentary at best. The few healers available relied heavily on herbal remedies and superstitions. Sometimes monks or priests acted as healers, using prayers alongside potions. Surgery was crude and painful, often performed without anesthesia or sterilization. Broken bones might be set, but infections were common and often fatal. Plagues and epidemics spread rapidly, wiping out large portions of villages with terrifying speed. The social structure of medieval society added another layer of struggle. Most people were peasants or serfs, bound to the land and to a lord. They worked tirelessly, but were rarely rewarded beyond mere subsistence. The lord claimed ownership of the land and everything on it, including the peasants themselves. Taxes and tithes drained what little wealth they had. The church demanded a tenth of their produce, adding spiritual and financial burden. If a peasant failed to meet obligations, punishment could be harsh: fines, imprisonment, or even loss of land and status. The legal system was biased toward the powerful. Nobles had their courts and laws, while peasants had little recourse against injustice. Violence was common and sometimes arbitrary. Women's lives were especially harsh. They bore children young and often, with many dying in childbirth or shortly after. Their days were filled with endless chores: cooking, cleaning, fetching water, tending gardens, spinning, weaving, and caring for the family. Education was rare. Most women were illiterate and confined to domestic roles. Widows or single women had few rights and faced poverty or exploitation. Yet, despite these difficulties, medieval people formed strong communities. Mutual aid was vital. Neighbors helped each other during harvests, repairs, and emergencies. Festivals and religious holidays, though infrequent, offered vital relief from the grind. Music, dance, and storytelling were cherished escapes from daily toil. Religious faith permeated every aspect of life, providing meaning amid suffering. The promise of heaven and eternal reward helped many endure their harsh existence. Pilgrimages, prayers, and rituals were acts of hope as much as devotion. Understanding the secret struggles of medieval life is essential to grasp the true nature of the era. It was not just a time of chivalry and castles, but of relentless hardship for the majority. This knowledge deepens our respect for those who lived through it and survived despite the odds stacked against them. The medieval era, often romanticized in books and films, is frequently misunderstood as a time dominated by gallant knights and fair maidens, castles and feasts, and grand adventures. While these images do exist in fragments, the true story is far grimmer. A tale defined by endurance through hardship and the constant battle against a world that was unforgiving at every turn. To understand what medieval survival truly required, we must look beyond the cliches and into the day-to-day existence of the common people, the peasants and serfs, whose lives formed the backbone of society, yet were often the hardest lived. Their days began before dawn and ended long after dusk, filled with back-breaking labor, relentless worry, and limited rewards. Agriculture was the foundation of medieval life, and with it came a never-ending cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting. The technology was primitive. Most work was done with simple hand tools and draft animals. The quality of the soil and the weather were beyond human control, yet these factors determined life or death. A bad harvest could spell famine and desperation. Crop failures were terrifyingly common. The medieval climate fluctuated, with periods of drought or excessive rain that could devastate fields. When famine struck, the consequences rippled through communities. Food prices soared, malnutrition weakened bodies, and disease spread quickly among the vulnerable. Food was often monotonous and insufficient. The diet of the average peasant was centered on grains, usually rye or barley, ground into coarse bread, and pottage, a thin stew of vegetables and sometimes legumes, or small amounts of meat. Meat was a luxury for most and only consumed occasionally, typically preserved as salted or smoked. Dairy products like cheese and butter were common, but depended heavily on livestock health. Hunting and gathering supplemented diets, but were limited by laws restricting commoners from hunting on noble lands. Those caught breaking these laws risked severe punishment. Fishing was sometimes an option for communities near rivers or coasts, but required skill and time. Sanitation was rudimentary, leading to the spread of parasites and diseases. Waste disposal was often little more than throwing refuse into the streets or nearby ditches. Clean water was scarce and frequently contaminated, contributing to outbreaks of deadly illnesses like dysentery and cholera. The medical knowledge of the time was limited and intertwined with superstition. Physicians relied on herbal remedies, bloodletting, and religious rituals. Surgery was crude and painful, often performed without anesthesia or antiseptics. Many diseases, including the Black Death, ravaged populations with devastating speed and high mortality rates. The social structure of medieval society further complicated survival. The rigid hierarchy placed peasants and serfs at the bottom, bound to their lord's land and subject to taxes, labor duties, and legal restrictions. Their autonomy was minimal, and their rights were few. Lords exercised power with little oversight, often exploiting those who worked the land. Women's roles were particularly demanding. Alongside agricultural labor, they managed households, raised children, and crafted textiles. Childbirth was perilous, with high rates of maternal and infant mortality. Women had limited access to education and were often dependent on male relatives for protection and support. Life expectancy was low. Many never lived past their 30s or 40s. Childhood was perilous, with high infant mortality rates due to malnutrition and disease. The hardships of life were compounded by warfare, banditry, and political instability. Despite these overwhelming challenges, medieval people showed remarkable resilience. They built communities bound by mutual aid, religious faith, and shared hardship. Festivals, markets, and religious observances offered moments of relief and social connection. This part of the story, the relentless struggle to survive and the quiet strength it demanded, is the true heart of medieval life. Understanding this reality not only reveals the toughness required, but also explains why modern survivalists would find the medieval world almost impossible to endure. Life in the medieval world was a relentless struggle shaped by forces often beyond human control. Whether it was the unpredictability of weather, the brutality of social structures, or the fragility of the human body, survival demanded a kind of toughness and resilience that few today can truly grasp. As we continue our journey into the secret struggles of medieval life, it becomes clear that every facet of existence was a battle. The climate itself could be merciless. Unlike today's relatively stable weather patterns, the medieval period saw swings between colder, wetter times and shorter, hotter summers. The so-called Little Ice Age that followed disrupted growing seasons, often leading to failed crops and famine. These environmental factors meant that farmers had to be both patient and prepared for the worst. Planting crops was not simply about dropping seeds into the soil. The medieval farmer had to know the right time to sow, the correct spacing, and how to rotate crops to keep the land fertile if they could afford to practice crop rotation at all. Many relied on three-field systems, where one field lay fallow each year to recover. But even this was no guarantee of success. When a crop failed, it wasn't just an inconvenience. It threatened the entire village's survival. Grain was the currency of life, used not only to feed people, but also to pay rents, taxes, and tithes. A poor harvest meant that families starved or went into debt, and lords often responded by increasing demands or harsh punishments. The labor involved in farming was exhausting. Men, women, and children all contributed to tasks like plowing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting. The tools were primitive: a wooden plow with an iron tip pulled by oxen, a sickle for cutting grain, a rake for gathering sheaves. The work was repetitive and physically demanding, requiring long hours under the sun or in the rain. Beyond the fields, other daily chores added to the burden. Fetching water could take hours, especially if the nearest source was a stream or well far from home. Firewood had to be gathered and chopped, a vital task for cooking and warmth. Food preparation itself was laborious, involving grinding grain into flour, baking bread in communal ovens, and preserving food through smoking or salting. Homes were simple and functional, but offered little comfort. The wattle and daub walls provided minimal insulation, and the thatched roofs leaked during heavy rains. Windows were rare, or covered with oiled cloth instead of glass. The hearth was the center of the home, used for cooking and heating, but it filled the space with smoke, making breathing difficult. Disease was a constant threat. Illnesses that are easily treated today, like infections or tooth decay, could become deadly. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, killed millions, wiping out nearly a third of the population. Even outside of epidemics, common ailments took a heavy toll, weakening bodies and shortening lives. Medical care was limited and often intertwined with religious beliefs. Physicians used a mixture of herbal remedies, bloodletting, and prayer. Surgery was a last resort, painful and dangerous without anesthesia or sterilization. Many people relied on folk healers or local wise women who passed down remedies orally. Socially, the medieval world was deeply hierarchical. Lords and clergy wielded power, while peasants and serfs had little autonomy. Justice was often harsh and arbitrary. Peasants were required to work the lord's land and pay rents and taxes, often leaving them with barely enough to survive. Women bore an unequal share of the burden. They worked alongside men in the fields, but also managed households, cared for children, and performed crafts like spinning and weaving. Childbirth was perilous, and many women died young. Widows and single women faced economic insecurity and social stigma. Despite these hardships, medieval people found moments of joy and community. Religious festivals, markets, and communal celebrations provided relief from the monotony. Music, dance, and storytelling were essential parts of life, offering escapism and hope. Understanding these secret struggles reveals the true toughness of medieval life. It was a world where survival demanded more than strength. It required resilience, adaptability, and a strong sense of community. The story of medieval life is one of endurance against overwhelming odds, a testament to the human spirit. Life in the medieval period was a relentless test of endurance, shaped by hardships so profound that many modern people struggle to imagine them. To truly understand what medieval survival demanded, we must dive deeper into the complexities of daily existence, exploring not just the physical struggles, but also the psychological and social pressures that shape this world. One of the most critical challenges was food security. While agriculture was the backbone of medieval life, the methods used were fragile and vulnerable to a host of variables. The feudal system placed heavy burdens on peasants, who cultivated land that wasn't theirs and paid steep rents and taxes in grain or labor. This arrangement left little room for error. Seasons were unpredictable. A late frost could destroy young seedlings, and prolonged rain could rot stored grain. Crop diseases such as rust and smut spread quickly, decimating harvests. When famine struck, it was devastating. Historical records tell of entire villages disappearing, their populations decimated by hunger and disease. The diet of the average medieval peasant was monotonous and often insufficient. Bread, made from coarse rye or barley, was the staple, supplemented by pottage, a watery stew made from vegetables and occasionally meat or fish. Protein was rare and typically reserved for special occasions or the wealthy. Nutritional deficiencies were common, leading to widespread malnutrition and weakened immune systems. Beyond the fields, the daily routine was grueling. Men and women worked long hours under the sun or in harsh weather conditions, performing physically demanding tasks such as plowing, sowing, and harvesting. Children were not spared. From an early age, they contributed to household and farm labor, learning skills necessary for survival. Water and sanitation posed ongoing dangers. Wells were often shallow and vulnerable to contamination from animal waste and human refuse. Drinking waterborne illnesses were frequent, leading to outbreaks of diseases like dysentery. Hygiene was rudimentary, and bathing was infrequent, partly due to superstitions and the practical difficulties of heating water. The home itself was a place of struggle. Houses were small, crowded, and cold. The dirt floor was sometimes covered with straw to provide minimal comfort. The hearth provided warmth, but also filled the room with smoke, as chimneys were rare. Families slept close together, sharing the limited warmth, but also the discomfort of cramped quarters. Clothing was simple and practical, but inadequate against harsh weather. Woolen garments provided some warmth, but many peasants lacked sufficient clothing, making winters especially brutal. Shoes were basic, often handmade from leather, but they wore out quickly and were expensive to replace. Healthcare was primitive. Medical knowledge was limited, and treatments were based on a mixture of herbal remedies, religious prayers, and sometimes dangerous procedures like bloodletting. Illnesses that are now easily cured often proved fatal. Epidemics, such as the plague, swept through communities with terrifying speed. Social structure reinforced hardship. Peasants were legally bound to their lord's land, forced to give a portion of their harvest and labor in exchange for protection. This system limited freedom and created cycles of poverty. Justice was often arbitrary, with punishments for minor infractions harsh and sometimes brutal. Women's lives were doubly difficult. They bore children under dangerous conditions, often facing early death in childbirth. Beyond motherhood, women labored alongside men in the fields and managed domestic tasks. They had little legal rights and were often subject to their husbands' or lords' authority. Despite the overwhelming difficulties, medieval communities developed systems of mutual aid. Festivals and religious holidays were vital for social cohesion, offering moments of respite and hope. Craftsmanship, music, and storytelling enriched life and preserved cultural identity. The secret struggles of medieval life reveal a world far removed from the romanticized visions we often see. It was a world where survival demanded endurance, adaptability, and an unyielding will. Understanding this reality helps us appreciate the strength and resilience of those who lived through these harsh times. The social fabric of medieval communities was tightly woven, but also fraught with tension. Peasants depended heavily on one another for survival, working cooperatively during planting and harvest seasons, sharing tools and labor. However, beneath this surface of cooperation lay conflicts over land boundaries, water rights, and communal resources. These disputes could escalate, sometimes violently, as every inch of fertile land was precious. The medieval village was more than a place to live. It was a complex microcosm where social roles, expectations, and hierarchies played out daily. The manorial system dictated much of life. Peasants owed labor and produce to their lord, who in turn provided protection and justice. But this protection was often minimal, and exploitation rampant. Serfs, bound to the land, had few rights and could not leave without permission, effectively trapped in a cycle of poverty. Agricultural technology was rudimentary, and despite incremental improvements like the heavy plow or watermills, productivity remained low by modern standards. The peasant's life revolved around the seasons, dictated by the church calendar and natural cycles. Holidays offered brief respite, but were often accompanied by their own burdens, such as religious fasting or obligatory tithes. Children were integral to the medieval workforce from a young age. They learned trades, helped in fields, and contributed to household tasks. Childhood was short and perilous, with high rates of disease and malnutrition. Education was mostly informal and focused on practical skills, with formal schooling reserved for the elite or those destined for clergy. Medieval women carried the dual burden of fieldwork and household management. They spun wool, tended gardens, prepared food, cared for children and the sick, and maintained homes often built without basic sanitation. Their work was crucial to the survival of the family, yet their social status was limited. Inheritance laws and legal rights favored men, and women's roles were largely defined by marriage and motherhood. Nutrition in the medieval period was often poor. A typical diet for peasants was heavy on grains and legumes, but light on protein and fresh vegetables. Malnutrition led to stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and high infant mortality. Food preservation techniques were basic, with salting, smoking, and drying common, but often insufficient to prevent spoilage. Hygiene was another constant challenge. Without modern plumbing, people relied on wells and streams, often contaminated by human and animal waste. Bathing was infrequent, partly due to beliefs linking water to illness or moral danger. Fleas and lice were common, contributing to the spread of disease. Medical practices blended superstition, herbal remedies, and limited empirical knowledge. Physicians and barber surgeons performed procedures without anesthesia or sterilization, making infections common and dangerous. Religious rituals often accompanied treatment, reflecting the deep intertwining of faith and medicine. Despite the grim realities, medieval people developed rich cultural traditions. Festivals, religious ceremonies, and communal gatherings provided psychological relief and strengthened bonds. Music, dance, and storytelling were vital to preserving history, morals, and identity. The arts flourished within religious and noble patronage, reflecting both spiritual devotion and worldly power. Trade and markets, while limited compared to today, connected villages and towns, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and culture. Craftsmen and merchants carved out niches within the economy, sometimes gaining wealth and influence despite the rigid social order. Religion permeated every aspect of life, offering hope, but also imposing strict moral codes. The church was both a spiritual authority and a powerful political entity, shaping laws, education, and social norms. The promise of salvation coexisted with fears of damnation, influencing behavior and social control. As we reflect on these layers of medieval life, the true secret struggles emerge, not just the visible hardships, but the emotional and social battles that defined existence. Fear, hope, resilience, and community interwove to create a complex tapestry that sustained people through centuries of uncertainty. The world of medieval survival was a relentless battlefield, not only against external forces, but also against the very environment that sustained and threatened life simultaneously. The landscape itself was both a provider and a predator, shaping the daily experiences and long-term prospects of those who lived within it. Forests, vast and dense, surrounded many medieval villages. These woods were a source of food, fuel, and building materials, but they also harbored dangers. Wolves, bears, and wild boars posed constant threats to both people and livestock. The fear of these predators influenced where and how communities settled and operated. Moreover, forests were often considered mysterious and even supernatural places, filled with legends of spirits, witches, and bandits. The edge between survival and superstition was thin, as people interpreted natural dangers through the lens of their beliefs and fears. Beyond the forests, rivers and marshlands provided resources like fish and reeds, but also carried the threat of flooding and disease. Swampy areas were breeding grounds for mosquitoes and other insects that spread illnesses like malaria, adding another layer of risk to daily survival. The medieval climate, while generally cooler than today, was subject to fluctuations that could mean the difference between plenty and famine. The Little Ice Age, beginning in the late Middle Ages, brought colder winters and shorter growing seasons, exacerbating food shortages and social unrest. Farming techniques were rudimentary and labor-intensive. The three-field system, a significant agricultural advancement, allowed for better land use, but required coordinated community effort. Crop rotation helped maintain soil fertility, but poor soil quality and erosion remained persistent problems. Livestock was vital, providing meat, milk, wool, and labor. Animals required care and feeding year-round, competing with humans for limited resources. Disease could wipe out herds, leading to economic disaster and starvation. Tools were basic but essential. The heavy plow revolutionized farming in northern Europe, allowing for deeper tilling of clay soils. However, tools were often handmade, expensive, and in short supply. Repairing and sharing equipment was common, underscoring the cooperative nature of rural life. The built environment reflected both necessity and limitation. Houses were simple, built from wood, wattle, and daub, or stone where available. The interiors were dark and smoky, with minimal furniture. Castles and fortified towns offered protection, but were centers of power and conflict, rather than everyday life for most people. Trade routes connected regions and allowed for the exchange of goods, ideas, and culture. Markets were focal points for economic activity, but could also be sites of tension and crime. Townspeople, merchants, and craftsmen formed distinct social groups with their own challenges and opportunities. Education and literacy were privileges of the elite. Most peasants relied on oral tradition, passing down knowledge and stories by word of mouth. Monasteries preserved written culture and served as centers of learning, but their influence rarely penetrated rural areas. The church's role was multifaceted. It provided spiritual guidance, social services, and a moral framework that shaped community life. Religious festivals punctuated the calendar, offering moments of joy and relief. Yet, the church also enforced conformity and social hierarchy, often suppressing dissent. Women's lives were a blend of hardship and agency. While constrained by social norms, many women managed households, ran businesses, and contributed to agricultural labor. Some women found roles within religious institutions, gaining education and influence. Family structures were complex and fluid. Extended kin networks provided support, but could also lead to conflict over inheritance and obligations. Childhood was precarious, with high mortality rates and early responsibilities. Amidst these struggles, medieval people developed resilience and adaptation strategies. Community solidarity, religious faith, and practical ingenuity allowed them to endure centuries of hardship. The secret struggles of medieval life reveal a world that was harsh, but also rich in human spirit. The reality of medieval survival was shaped by a relentless combination of environmental hardships, social restrictions, and personal endurance. Life was a constant negotiation with forces beyond individual control, whether the weather, disease, social hierarchies, or even the very land itself. One of the defining struggles of medieval life was access to clean water. Most villages relied on wells, streams, or rivers, but these sources were vulnerable to contamination. Waste disposal was rudimentary, and human and animal waste often polluted water supplies, causing outbreaks of illnesses like dysentery and cholera. The close proximity of livestock to human dwellings further exacerbated these problems. Hygiene practices were minimal by modern standards. Bathing was infrequent, sometimes considered unhealthy or sinful. The lack of proper sanitation infrastructure meant that parasites, lice, and fleas thrived. These pests not only caused discomfort but also spread diseases, including the bubonic plague. Food scarcity was a perpetual threat. Harvests could fail due to bad weather, pests, or soil exhaustion. When crops failed, famine struck, bringing widespread malnutrition and death. The diet of most medieval peasants was monotonous and lacked essential nutrients, making them vulnerable to diseases such as scurvy and rickets. Food preservation was a vital skill, involving salting, smoking, drying, and fermenting. These methods allowed people to survive the winter months when fresh food was unavailable. Still, the risk of spoilage and foodborne illness was ever present. Medical knowledge was primitive. The medieval medical system combined elements of herbal remedies, superstition, and religious rituals. Physicians were few, and mostly served the wealthy. The general population relied on folk healers and midwives. Surgical procedures were rudimentary, painful, and risky due to the absence of anesthesia and antiseptics. Childbirth was particularly dangerous. Maternal and infant mortality rates were high. Midwives provided care, but complications often resulted in death. The lack of medical intervention meant that many families lost children early, adding emotional trauma to their hardships. Disease outbreaks were frequent and devastating. The Black Death in the 14th century wiped out an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population. Other epidemics, such as smallpox and leprosy, also shaped social and economic structures. Leper colonies isolated the afflicted, reflecting both fear and religious attitudes towards disease. Social hierarchy dictated access to resources, protection, and opportunities. Nobles and clergy lived comparatively comfortable lives, though they too faced risks. Peasants bore the brunt of economic exploitation and physical hardship. Serfdom tied many to the land, limiting mobility and personal freedom. Land ownership and use were central to medieval life. The manorial system structured economic and social relationships. Lords granted land to vassals, who in turn relied on peasants to work the fields. This system created obligations, but also dependencies that shaped daily existence. Work was arduous and unending. Agricultural labor dominated most lives, with seasonal cycles demanding intense effort. Tools were simple, and much labor was manual. In towns, craftsmen and merchants faced different challenges, but also limited security. Religion infused every aspect of life. It offered hope and community, but also imposed strict moral codes. The church influenced education, law, and culture. Religious festivals punctuated the year, providing moments of joy amid hardship. Women's roles, though constrained, were vital. They managed households, worked in fields, and sometimes engaged in trade or crafts. Some women found relative autonomy as nuns or widows. Despite overwhelming obstacles, medieval people demonstrated resilience. They adapted to their environment, forged social bonds, and found meaning in faith and tradition. The secret struggles of medieval life reveal a world both harsh and deeply human. Medieval life was a complex tapestry of relentless hardship, social constraints, and moments of human endurance that often go unnoticed in the grand narratives of history. To truly grasp what survival meant in those times, one must look beyond the romanticized castles and knights, and instead peer into the daily lives of the common people whose struggles were nothing short of epic. The agricultural calendar ruled every facet of medieval existence. The rhythm of planting, tending, and harvesting crops dictated work hours, rest, and social activities. Long before the dawn of industrial machinery, the plow, scythe, and sickle were the tools that shaped survival. These implements, though simple by today's standards, required immense physical labor. The soil was tough and unyielding, and the weather was an unpredictable adversary that could wipe out an entire season's work in days. Living conditions were Spartan and often unsanitary. Villages were crowded, with houses made from timber and wattle and daub, featuring thatched roofs prone to leaks and infestations of pests. The interior spaces were dark, smoky from open hearth fires, and cold during harsh winters. Ventilation was minimal, and people slept on straw-filled mattresses or wooden benches. Nutrition was poor, heavily reliant on bread made from coarse grains, with occasional supplements of vegetables, legumes, and dairy products. Meat was a luxury reserved for the wealthy or special occasions. The nutritional deficiencies weakened the population's immune systems, making them susceptible to diseases and reducing overall life expectancy. Water sources were another major concern. Wells and streams served as the primary means of obtaining water, but these were often contaminated by runoff from waste disposal sites and livestock. The result was frequent outbreaks of waterborne diseases, including dysentery, typhoid, and cholera. Healthcare was rudimentary and steeped in superstition. Physicians were few and largely inaccessible to the poor. The majority depended on folk remedies, herbal medicines, and prayers. The medical knowledge of the time was limited, and treatments such as bloodletting and purging often did more harm than good. The social fabric was rigid, with clear divisions between nobles, clergy, peasants, and serfs. Peasants were legally bound to their lord's lands, lacking freedom of movement and autonomy. Their labor sustained the manorial economy, but offered little in return beyond subsistence. Taxes and tithes further drained their meager resources. Women faced additional burdens. They were expected to manage households, care for children, perform agricultural work, and maintain the home, all while having limited rights. Education was largely denied to them, except in religious settings, where some could become nuns. Child mortality rates were alarmingly high, with many children not surviving past infancy due to malnutrition and disease. Childhood was a fragile stage of life, with early introduction to labor and responsibility. Despite these immense challenges, medieval communities cultivated resilience through close-knit social ties, religious faith, and cultural traditions. Festivals and church ceremonies provided relief from daily toil and a sense of belonging. Oral storytelling preserved history and fostered communal identity. The relentless demands of survival forged a population adapted to hardship, but the constant threat of famine, disease, and violence meant that stability was elusive. Understanding these secret struggles reveals the true toughness of medieval life and why modern assumptions about simple past lives are profoundly misleading. In the shadowed corners of medieval existence, beneath the grand narratives of kings and crusades, lay the true battlegrounds of survival. For the vast majority of people, life was a relentless contest against nature, disease, poverty, and social constraints. The day-to-day challenges of medieval survival were neither heroic nor glamorous, but brutally practical, and often heartbreaking. The landscape itself could be as unforgiving as any enemy army. Fields needed constant care to yield enough grain, but crops were vulnerable to drought, floods, frost, and pests. A single bad harvest could mean starvation for an entire village. The absence of modern agricultural technology meant that every grain was earned through backbreaking labor, often from dawn to dusk. Medieval peasants lived with the constant specter of famine. Food scarcity was cyclical and deeply tied to the land's productivity. The diet was overwhelmingly monotonous: coarse bread made from rye or barley, with small amounts of vegetables such as onions, cabbage, and peas. Meat was rare and usually reserved for those with better means or special occasions like festivals. The lack of nutritional variety led to widespread vitamin deficiencies, weakening immune systems, and increasing susceptibility to disease. Water, essential to life, was also a source of danger. Wells and nearby rivers often became contaminated due to poor sanitation practices. Latrines were primitive or absent, leading to human and animal waste seeping into water supplies. Epidemics such as dysentery, typhoid, and cholera frequently swept through communities, decimating populations already weakened by malnutrition. The medieval understanding of health was deeply intertwined with superstition and religious belief. The medical knowledge available was rudimentary and often counterproductive. Common treatments included bloodletting, purging, and the use of herbs and charms. Physicians were few and mostly served the wealthy elite. For the majority, healing came from local wise women, herbalists, or priests offering prayers and blessings. Childbirth was particularly perilous. Without modern sanitation and medical knowledge, complications often resulted in the death of the mother, the child, or both. Midwives played an essential role, but many women faced their pregnancies alone, or with minimal assistance. High infant mortality rates meant that many families grieved the loss of multiple children. Living quarters were cramped, dark, and smoky. Houses were typically constructed of timber, with wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs. Hearth fires provided heat and cooking facilities, but filled the small rooms with smoke, contributing to respiratory problems. Privacy was minimal, and whole families often shared a single room. Social status deeply influenced one's experience of medieval life. Nobles and clergy enjoyed relative comfort and security, but even they were not immune to the era's hardships. Peasants and serfs, who made up the bulk of the population, endured grinding poverty and near constant labor. Their freedoms were limited, and they were subject to the will of their lords, who demanded labor, produce, and taxes. Women bore the weight of additional expectations. Besides contributing to agricultural and domestic labor, they were responsible for managing the household and caring for children. Legal rights for women were severely restricted. Education was largely unavailable, except within convents where some could find learning and influence. Despite all these challenges, medieval communities found ways to cope and even thrive in small ways. Religious festivals and feast days punctuated the harsh calendar, offering moments of joy and respite. Markets and fairs were opportunities for trade, socialization, and the exchange of news and ideas. Oral traditions preserved histories, customs, and knowledge. Storytelling, music, and religious observances were vital to community cohesion and identity. These cultural practices sustained hope and resilience in a world where material security was scarce. The secret struggles of medieval life reveal a picture of humanity under siege, but not defeated. The endurance of individuals and communities amid such adversity is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Life in medieval times was a delicate balance of endurance and adaptability, often overshadowed by hardship, but marked by an incredible will to survive. Every day presented new challenges that required constant vigilance and effort. The agricultural cycle defined the pace of life, with sowing, tending, and harvesting demanding all available energy. Peasants worked from early morning until dusk, often accompanied by children who helped with lighter tasks. The use of oxen and horses eased some labor, but manual toil remained intense. Tools were crude but effective. Wooden plows, sickles, and scythes were essential for harvesting grain, while hoes and spades prepared the soil for planting. Despite these efforts, soil exhaustion was a recurring problem, prompting some communities to adopt crop rotation systems. But these innovations were slow to spread. Weather was a perpetual concern. A late frost could destroy budding crops. Droughts could parch fields. Excessive rain could cause floods and soil erosion. Any of these calamities threatened food security and livelihoods. When harvests failed, communities faced famine. Starvation sapped strength and made people vulnerable to disease and social unrest. Nutrition in medieval times was limited and monotonous. The daily bread of peasants was dense and coarse, often made from rye or barley flour rather than wheat, which was more expensive. Legumes like peas and beans provided protein, but fresh meat was a rare luxury for the lower classes. Fish was more accessible for those near rivers or coasts, but required preservation methods like smoking or salting to last. Dairy products, milk, cheese, butter, added some variety, but depended on seasonal availability and livestock health. Water sources were critical but dangerous. Wells were the safest option, but their depth and cleanliness varied. Streams and rivers, while convenient, were easily contaminated by runoff, sewage, and animals. Contaminated water was a vector for illnesses such as dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. Sanitation facilities were minimal, with chamber pots and open latrines common in villages, spreading pathogens. Medical knowledge was limited and often intertwined with superstition. Treatments were based on balancing the body's four humors, a theory inherited from ancient Greek medicine. Bloodletting, purging, and herbal concoctions were common remedies, but often weakened patients further. Religious faith played a strong role in healing practices, with prayers, pilgrimages, and relics believed to cure illness. Most medical care was delivered by monks, nuns, or wise women skilled in herbalism, rather than formally trained doctors. Childbirth was a dangerous event for both mother and child. Without antiseptics, anesthesia, or skilled surgeons, complications were often fatal. Midwives assisted, using traditional knowledge passed down through generations, but mortality rates remained high. Families faced the heartbreak of losing multiple children before adulthood, with infant mortality rates estimated at nearly 30 to 50%. Housing was humble and practical, but offered little comfort. Peasant homes were small, with 1 or 2 rooms made from timber frames and wattle and daub walls. Thatched roofs leaked, and floors were dirt or packed earth. A central hearth provided cooking facilities and warmth, but also filled the space with smoke. Furniture was sparse wooden benches, simple tables, and straw mattresses. Privacy was a luxury rarely afforded. Social order was strict and hierarchical. The feudal system structured relationships between lords and vassals, with peasants obligated to work the lord's lands, pay rents, and provide services. Serfs, tied legally to the land, had few rights and faced harsh penalties for disobedience. Peasants had some freedoms, but lived under constant economic pressure and insecurity. Women's lives were especially demanding. Beyond household chores, many worked alongside men in fields, gardens, and crafts. Their labor was essential to family survival. However, women's legal rights were limited. They could not own property independently, and their roles were confined by custom and law. Some women gained influence through marriage alliances or by entering religious life as nuns. Despite the hardships, medieval communities found ways to celebrate and support one another. Festivals aligned with the religious calendar marked brief respites from toil, featuring feasts, dancing, and games. Markets and fairs were vital for trade and socializing, where news and stories were exchanged. Oral storytelling preserved history, legends, and communal identity. These traditions reinforced shared values and provided comfort amid adversity. Religion was central, offering hope and structure to an otherwise precarious existence. Understanding these secret struggles reveals the remarkable resilience of medieval people who endured a world shaped by uncertainty, inequality, and endless labor. Their lives were not simply boring or dark, but a testament to human endurance in the face of relentless hardship. As the medieval era drew toward its later centuries, the world was changing in ways that would eventually transform the harsh realities of daily life. But for those living through it, the struggles remained immediate and pressing, constant reminders of the fragility of existence and the strength required to survive. The hardships faced by medieval people were multifaceted, encompassing not only the physical demands of subsistence, but also the complex social and cultural pressures that defined their world. The struggle to secure food, shelter, and health was only one aspect. Survival also meant navigating rigid social hierarchies, religious expectations, and communal responsibilities. By this period, some innovations began to ease the burdens of medieval life, though progress was slow and uneven. Agricultural techniques improved with the wider adoption of the 3-field crop rotation system, which helped restore soil fertility and increased yields. The heavy plow, pulled by horses instead of oxen, allowed deeper tilling, especially in the heavier soils of northern Europe. Watermills and windmills started to become more common, mechanizing some of the most tedious tasks like grinding grain. Yet even with these advances, survival remained precarious. Plagues and diseases continued to ravage populations, with the infamous Black Death in the mid-14th century, killing an estimated 1/3 of Europe's people. This catastrophic event reshaped social and economic structures, sometimes alleviating peasant burdens as labor shortages empowered workers to demand better conditions. But the trauma it left was profound. Life expectancy remained low, and most people lived lives marked by pain, loss, and hard work. Infant mortality was high, infectious diseases common, and accidents frequent. The medieval mindset accepted suffering as part of God's will, with the Church providing spiritual solace and an explanation for life's hardships. Women's roles began to evolve subtly as well, especially in urban centers where some engaged in trade and crafts. While legal restrictions persisted, some women gained influence through guilds or family businesses. Still, most lived within strict societal norms, bearing the brunt of domestic and agricultural labor. Education and literacy were limited but expanding. Monasteries, cathedral schools, and later universities preserved and transmitted knowledge. The rise of vernacular literature made stories and information accessible to broader audiences. These developments slowly laid the groundwork for the intellectual transformations of the Renaissance. Medieval towns grew as centers of commerce and culture, offering new opportunities and challenges. Urban life brought diverse populations into contact, increased trade, and fostered innovation. However, towns also faced overcrowding, poor sanitation, and frequent outbreaks of disease, maintaining a high level of risk for inhabitants. Despite the relentless difficulties, medieval people cultivated a rich cultural and spiritual life. Art, music, architecture, and literature flourished, reflecting the complexities and aspirations of the era. Gothic cathedrals soared as symbols of faith and community effort. Manuscripts illuminated with vibrant colors preserved religious texts, history, and knowledge. In the end, the secret struggles of medieval life reveal a story of endurance amid adversity. They remind us that history is not just the tale of kings and battles, but the lived experience of ordinary people whose efforts, hopes, and sufferings shaped the foundation of modern society. Their lives, often overlooked or romanticized, were defined by a resilience that still resonates today, a testament to human determination in the face of unrelenting hell.